Introduction to Mark, for whom this Gospel is named, was a close companion of the Apostle Peter and a recurring character in the book of Acts, where he is known as John, whose surname was Mark, Acts 12, 25, 15, 37, 39. It was to John Mark's mother's home in Jerusalem that Peter went when released from prison, Acts 12. John Mark was a cousin of Barnabas, Col. 4:10, who accompanied Paul and Barnabas on Paul's first missionary journey, Acts 12, 25-13, 5. But he left them at Perga and returned to Jerusalem, Acts 13. When Barnabas wanted Paul to take John Mark on the second missionary journey, Paul refused. The resulting friction between Paul and Barnabas led to their separation, Acts 15, 38-40. John Mark's earlier vacillation, however, evidently gave way to strength and maturity, and in time he proved himself even to the Apostle Paul. When Paul wrote the Colossians, he instructed them that if John Mark were to come, they were to welcome him, Col. 4:10. Paul even listed Mark as a fellow worker, Philem. 24. Later, Paul told Timothy, "Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me for ministry," 2 Tim. 4:11. John Mark's restoration to useful ministry may have been, in part, due to the ministry of Peter. Peter's close relationship with Mark is evident from his description of him as Mark my son, 1 Pet. 5:13. Peter, of course, was no stranger to failure himself, and his influence on the younger man was, no doubt, instrumental in helping him out of the instability of his youth and into the strength and maturity he would need for the work to which God had called him. Author and date. Unlike the epistles, the Gospels do not name their authors in their texts. The early Church Fathers, however, unanimously affirm that Mark wrote this second Gospel. Papias, Bishop of Hierapolis, writing about AD 140, noted, and the presbyter the Apostle John said this: Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately whatsoever he remembered. It was not, however, in exact order that he related the sayings or deeds of Christ. For he neither heard the Lord nor accompanied him. But afterwards, as I said, he accompanied Peter, who accommodated his instructions to the necessities of his hearers, but with no intention of giving a regular narrative of the Lord's sayings. Wherefore Mark made no mistake in thus writing some things as he remembered them. For one thing, he took special care not to omit anything he had heard and not to put anything fictitious into the statements. From the exposition of the oracles of the Lord, 6, Justin Martyr, writing about AD 150, referred to the Gospel of Mark as the Memoirs of Peter, and suggested that Mark wrote his Gospel in Italy. This agrees with the uniform voice of early tradition, which regarded this Gospel as having been written in Rome for the benefit of Roman Christians. Writing about AD 185, Irenaeus called Mark the disciple and interpreter of Peter, and he noted that the second Gospel consists of what Peter preached about Christ. The testimony of the Church Fathers differs as to whether this Gospel was written before or after Peter's death, ca. AD 67-68. Evangelical scholars have suggested dates for the writing of Mark's Gospel ranging from AD 50 to 70. A date before the destruction of Jerusalem and the Temple in AD 70 is required by Jesus' comment recorded in 13:2, referring to the Temple, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone shall be left upon another, that shall not be thrown down." Luke's Gospel was clearly written before Acts, Acts 1:1-3. The date of the writing of Acts can probably be fixed around AD 63 because that is shortly after the narrative ends. It is likely, therefore, though not certain, that Mark was written at an early date, sometime in the 50s. Background and setting: while Matthew was written to a Jewish audience, Mark seems to have targeted Roman believers, particularly Gentiles. When employing Aramaic terms, Mark translated them for his readers, 3:17, 5:41, 7:11, 34, 10, 46, 14, 36, 15, 22, 34. On the other hand, in some places he used Latin expressions instead of their Greek equivalents, 5, 9, 12, 15, 42, 15, 16, 39. He also reckoned time according to the Roman system, 6, 48, 13, 35, and carefully explained Jewish customs, 7, 34, 14, 12, 15, 42. Mark omitted Jewish elements, such as the genealogies found in Matthew and Luke. This Gospel also makes fewer references to the Old Testament and includes less material that would be of particular interest to Jewish readers, such as that which is critical of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Sadducees are mentioned only once, in 12:18. When mentioning Simon the Cyrene, 15:21, Mark identifies him as the father of Rufus, a prominent member of the church at Rome, Rom. 16:13. All of this supports the traditional view that Mark was written for a Gentile audience initially at Rome. Historical and theological themes. Mark presents Jesus as the suffering servant of the Lord, 10:45. His focus is on the deeds of Jesus more than his teaching, particularly emphasizing service and sacrifice. Mark omits the lengthy discourses found in the other Gospels, often relating only brief excerpts to give the gist of Jesus' teaching. Mark also omits any account of Jesus' ancestry and birth, beginning where Jesus' public ministry began with his baptism by John in the wilderness. Mark demonstrates the humanity of Christ more clearly than any of the other evangelists, emphasizing Christ's human emotions, 1:41, 3, 5, 6, 34, 8, 12, 9, 36, his human limitations, 4, 38, 11, 12, 13, 32, and other small details that highlight the human side of the Son of God, for example, 7, 33, 34, 8, 12, 9, 36, 10, 13, 16. Interpretive challenges. 3 significant questions confront the interpreter of Mark. 1. What is the relationship of Mark to Luke and Matthew? See below, the Synoptic Problem. 2. How should one interpret the eschatological passages? 3. Are the last 12 verses of chapter 16 originally part of Mark's Gospel? The Synoptic Problem. Even a cursory reading of Matthew, Mark, and Luke reveals both striking similarities, 2, 3:12, Matt. 9, 2:8, Luke 5, 18:26, and significant differences, as each views the life, ministry, and teaching of Jesus. The question of how to explain those similarities and differences is known as the Synoptic Problem. Syn means together, optic means seeing. The modern solution, even among some evangelicals, has been to assume that some form or literary dependence exists among the Synoptic Gospels. The most commonly accepted theory to explain such an alleged literary dependence is known as the two-source theory. According to that hypothesis, Mark was the first Gospel written, and Matthew and Luke then used Mark as a source in writing their Gospels. Proponents of this view imagine a non-existent second source, labeled Q, from the German word Quelle, source, and argue that this is the source of the material in Matthew and Luke that does not appear in Mark. They advance several lines of evidence to support their scenario. First, most of Mark is paralleled in Matthew and Luke. Since it is much shorter than Matthew and Luke, the latter must be expansions of Mark. Second, the 3 Gospels follow the same general chronological outline, but when either Matthew or Luke departs from Mark's chronology, the other agrees with Mark. Put another way, Matthew and Luke do not both depart from Mark's chronology in the same places. That, it is argued, shows that Matthew and Luke used Mark for their historical framework. Third, in passages common to all 3 Gospels, Matthew's and Luke's wording seldom agrees when they differ from Mark's. Proponents of the two-source theory see this as confirmation that Matthew and Luke used Mark's Gospel as a source. Those arguments do not prove that Matthew and Luke used Mark's Gospel as a source, however. In fact, the weight of evidence is strongly against such a theory. 1. The nearly unanimous testimony of the Church until the 19th century was that Matthew was the first Gospel written. Such an impressive body of evidence cannot be ignored. 2. Why would Matthew, an apostle, an eyewitness to the events of Christ's life, depend on Mark, who was not an eyewitness, even for the account of his own conversion? 3. A significant statistical analysis of the Synoptic Gospels has revealed that the parallels between them are far less extensive and the differences more significant than is commonly acknowledged. The differences, in particular, argue against literary dependence among the Gospel writers. 4. Since the Gospels record actual historical events, it would be surprising if they did not follow the same general historical sequence. For example, the fact that 3 books on American history all have the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, the Vietnam War, and the Gulf War in the same chronological order would not prove that the authors had read each other's books. General agreement in content does not prove literary dependency. 5. The passages in which Matthew and Luke agree against Mark, see argument 3 in favor of the 2-source theory, amount to about 1/6 of Matthew and 1/6 of Luke. If they used Mark's Gospel as a source, there is no satisfactory explanation for why Matthew and Luke would so often both change Mark's wording in the same way. 6. The 2-source theory cannot account for the important section in Mark's Gospel, 6:45-8-26, that Luke omits. This omission suggests Luke had not seen Mark's Gospel when he wrote his book. 7. There is no historical or manuscript evidence that the Q document ever existed. It is purely a fabrication of modern skepticism and a way to possibly deny the verbal inspiration of the Gospels. 8. Any theory of literary dependence between Gospel writers overlooks the significance of their personal contacts with each other. Mark and Luke were both companions of Paul, Philem. 24. The early church, including Matthew, met for a time in the home of Mark's mother, Acts 12:12, and Luke could easily have met Matthew during Paul's 2-year imprisonment at Caesarea. Such contacts make theories of mutual literary dependence unnecessary. The simplest solution to the synoptic problem is that no such problem exists. Because critics cannot prove literary dependence among the Gospel writers, there is no need to explain it. The traditional view that the Gospel writers were inspired by God and wrote independently of each other except that all 3 were moved by the same Holy Spirit, 2 Pet. 1:20, remains the only plausible view. As the reader compares the various viewpoints in the Gospels, it becomes clear how well they harmonize and lead to a more complete picture of the whole event or message. The accounts are not contradictory but complementary, revealing a fuller understanding when brought together.